Next guitar player I'd like to ask about is Randy Rhoads.
Mm.
How did your time with him come about?
I'd come out of Rainbow. I was looking for work possibilities and that. You know, I'd go around sort of clubs and venues around London. And one night there was a band in London playing at a gig called the Music Machine in Camden. And I knew the band, it was called Girl, the band, and I knew they were signed to Jet Records. And I thought, if I go to their gig, I'll at least know some people there. And I went backstage and saw, because I'd been signed to Jet Records with Widowmaker. So I went and I hooked up with one of the guys there called Arthur Sharp. And he said to me, do you know Ozzy? And I said, well, I've probably met him, but I said, I wouldn't say I know him. He said, oh, he's here tonight, I'll introduce you. So I got chatting to Ozzy, and he said, he knew I'd come out of Rainbow. He said, I'm putting a band together soon. He'd just come back from America. He'd been in LA, and he got fired from Black Sabbath. And he said, I'm putting a band together. Do you want to come up to my house and we'll have a bit of a knock together, you know? They weren't auditions. They were just sort of, let's see how it works. If you're interested, we'll see how if we work together. And so I went up to his house, and he had a couple of other musicians there, a guitarist and a drummer. And they were okay, they were nice guys, they were decent players, but they weren't really world class, you know. So Ozzy and I went out into the kitchen after we had a bit of a knock together with these other two guys. And I said, well, if you want to get serious about it, I'd be interested. I said, but I don't think these blokes are what I would call world class. He said, oh, hang on a minute. He walked out of the kitchen. He had a rehearsal room built integrally on his house. He said, hey fellas, pack up, it's not working out, you can go home now. He just did it like that. And then he came back out and he phoned Arthur Sharp at Jet Records, and I still remember his words. He said, oh, it's great, Bob and I get on like a house on fire. The fire brigade's just left. That's what I still remember him saying that. Yeah. But then he said, I met this guitarist in LA. He works at a guitar school and he's a guitar teacher. His name's Randy Rhoads. And when he said a bloke that works as a guitar teacher, I envisioned somebody in a cardigan with glasses and a pipe and slippers or something, you know. Anyway, David Arden at Jet Records, who was Don Arden's son, organised Randy to come over to England, and then Ozzy, Randy and I hooked up at Jet Records, and then we all caught a train up to Ozzy's place and started working out material. We had a play together just to see if it would work. And I remember at one of the first times we stopped, and Ozzy walked out the room to get a glass of water, a cup of tea or a beer or whatever it was. And Randy and I looked at each other just as we stopped playing, and we said at the same time, we said, oh, I like the way you play. And it was like, you know, the same time, which is, I thought that's a bit strange.
Yeah.
But then we started auditioning drummers and writing stuff, and that's how that came about.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I thought you and Lee Kerslake came as a package for some reason. Okay.
No, we looked for months. We auditioned 40, 50 drummers. Some of them were nice guys but didn't play so well. Some of them played okay but they weren't quite right, or you know, it was just hard to get the person who had the strength and power and aggression in their playing, and that we could get on with, and there were lots and lots of drummers, you know. It's just it was almost getting to the point of like pull your hair out, and then right at the end, I think we had about a week to go. Somebody at Jet Records, I don't know if it came from Don Arden himself or might have been David or Arthur Sharp or somebody, said, if you don't find a drummer soon, we want our product. We want an album done. We're going to have to get a session drummer and put them in with you just to get the album done until you find the person you want. And Cozy Powell was mentioned, the drummer from Rainbow, and we thought, oh God, you know, it'd be better to have the band complete rather than have a session player and then have to keep looking. You know. And we had one drummer left to audition, and that was Lee Kerslake. And we auditioned Lee at Shepperton Film Studios. And as soon as he started playing, I remember Randy and I looked at each other. It was where the fuck have you been? Why weren't you here 40 drummers ago? But he was. It was instant. It was just, yep, this is the guy.
So the whole band just had magic once he was added.
That's right. That's right. And that helped to complete the whole picture. The saying, the whole is much greater than just the sum of the parts. Really applied to that situation as well, because everybody brought out the good in everyone else. We all inspired each other in one way or another, and you could see and feel Randy developing as the band went on, and everything just beginning to fit together.
Yeah, I remember I was living in Chicago at the time when that album came out, and
the first one, Blizzard of Oz,
Blizzard of Oz, and I heard Crazy Train, and I thought, what is that? I'd never heard anything like it before. It was sensational. What are your observations about Randy's playing?
Well, I suppose one of the unusual things for a young player like that was very into, the heavy and aggressive people like Jimi Hendrix and Jimmy Page and all the rock stuff, that he had this classical side to him. And that really helped to give him another dimension and another colour compared with other guitarists. He wasn't sort of like just straight ahead rock. It had that other dimension of the classical thing, which really, it gave his playing a uniqueness.
Yeah. And what was your highlight of the time playing with Randy Rhoads?
Well, it was good to feel the situation when it gelled and formed and became complete with the four of us, with Lee, to be able to create stuff in an era that wasn't really an ideal era for that type of music. Because if you think 1979 going into 1980, which was when all that happened, the big things were punk and disco and the sort of new wave stuff, and a lot of the stuff that we'd been involved with or had been a part of was considered dinosaur by then. But we didn't really think, well, how can we become in vogue or in fashion? How can we get a hit record, or how can we make lots of money, or how can we get airplay, or what's in this week that we can be like? We just went in and we played and we did what we loved and what we wanted to do from the heart. And I think that's possibly part of the ingredient that helped to give it the longevity and become the classic stuff that it is now.
Yeah.
And that was a highlight for me, to be able to express yourself from the heart rather than being, you have to do it this way because this is in, that's out.
Well, the next player I'd like to ask you about is Gary Moore. How did you come to be with Gary Moore?
Gary Moore was also on Jet Records.
Okay.
And I'd seen Gary several times around doing gigs either with him or on the same bill, that sort of thing. And it was actually Sharon Osbourne that mentioned to Gary when he needed a bass player to do a session on some tracks on the album at the time was Victims of the Future. And Sharon suggested me to do some tracks, so I went in and he was really pleased. And then not long after that, he had a live video to do of a gig in Ireland. Actually, I think it was a gig in Dublin and a gig in Belfast, and they were going to use the best of the two shows for his live video release, and he asked me to do that then. And I remember he was very pleased at the end of it. At the end of the second show, we were all having a drink, and it was over. And because I'd only had, I think, something like 5 days to learn 14 songs, rehearse them, and get them right, and then be filmed doing them. So there was no room for, for fuck ups or whatever. But he was very pleased, and he came in and said to me, "Look," he said, "if you're ever interested in having a gig, there's one here for you." So when Ozzy and I fell out the next year in '85, Ozzy and I had a bit of a fallout. And Gary, at the time, I phoned Neil Carter, who was the keyboard player, other guitarist in the band with Gary. And he said, "Oh, Gary's just got Glenn Hughes in the band from Deep Purple." And I thought, that's not going to work out. I knew there would be a clash there. I said, well, okay, give me a call in about a month or so when it doesn't work out. And sure enough, I got the call. It didn't work out, and then I went to work with Gary.
Mm. What were your observations about him as a player?
Gary?
Yeah.
Oh, he's brilliant.
Mm.
Great player. I love Gary's playing. He's and he's a funny bloke too.
Is
He and I just hit it off really well. You know, we'd be in hysterics laughing sometimes. He's got a great sense of humour. He's very witty. He's very quick, and he's a very clever player. You know, the old saying of jack of all trades, master of none. He's jack of all trades and master of all of them. No, he's good at every style. Gary's a great player at every style.
Yeah, yeah. We talked earlier about that recording I heard of him doing a hideaway, and it's so powerful. You know, it's just But
I think some of Gary's best playing is when he's just messing about.
Yeah.
You know, he tends to sometimes perfect things or over perfect them a little bit in the studio.
Yeah.
But when he lets rip and he's not too worried about having it perfect, I think that's his best playing.
Yeah.
That's just me, but you know.
How many albums were you on with him? There's quite a few, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Victims of the Future was the first one. I did, 3 or 4 tracks on that. And then Run for Cover, I think I only played on one track, and because I was doing other stuff, and then came in at the end of it, and then went on the road with him. And then there was Wild Frontier. Then there was After the War.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was Still Got the Blues for You, some tracks on that, and After Hours. So there's quite a few.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and one of my favourite albums that I played on with Gary was Power of the Blues. I played on all of that, and that was 2003 we recorded that. I went over there to do the album. Then 2004 we'd just started doing some shows, and he got a poisoned finger.
Oh.
And the gigs were pulled, and we didn't get a chance really to promote the album properly, so it kind of died a bit. But that's one of my favourite Gary Moore albums, Power of the Blues. It's because it wasn't too over planned or anything. It was it had spontaneity. You know, it was get in the studio, this is a song we're doing, let's have a run through, try this, try that, okay, let's record it, boom. At the end of 9 days we had all the backing tracks done.
Right.
So I remember Gary saying to me, he said, the last album, he said, it took us 3 months to get to this stage.
Mm-hmm. Was there a lot of improvising in his shows?
No, I wouldn't say a lot of improvising. A similar sort of thing to, here's the boundaries.
Right.
You can do this and this and this here, and that might be a bit different each night. And some things would go on longer or a bit shorter or whatever, and it was always the nod and the wink.
Right. Okay. And I mean, a tune like Still Got the Blues, he'd have to do that note perfect, wouldn't it?
Yeah. There was a song we used to do. It was an instrumental called The Loner.
Oh yes.
And some nights, if he was into playing it, it would go on and on and on. The intro one night was about 4 minutes, and the whole thing ended up about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But it was fun because it was always a little bit of a challenge as well, you know, of what's going to happen next. But usually it was fairly disciplined.
Did you get to write with him at all?
No, not really. No, he's pretty self-sufficient.
Right.
Gary, with music and his lyrics and his song ideas, he's a good writer as well as a good player.
You know, it occurs to me like Still Got the Blues is the same chord progression as Autumn Leaves.
Oh yeah.
So I expect when I noticed that.
Well, there's a similarity between a few of those. There's the Loner, there's Parisian Walkway,
which is Blue Bossa.
Yeah,
I noticed that. So he must have a knowledge of the standards.
Oh yeah.
Did you ever get to play any standards with him?
Isn't there a Santana song called Europe or something?
Europa, yeah.
Europa, is it? That's okay.
Yeah.
And that's very similar to Parisian Walkways.
Yeah. I suppose grab the chord progression and do some stuff on top. Yeah. What was your highlight of playing with him?
Probably the. I'd always had a lot of respect for him as a player, and players like that for me sometimes had a little bit of. I felt a little bit intimidated, you know, but getting into the camp and then being a part of it, that was a nice feeling, you know, because I had a lot of respect for Gary and his playing. It was, You know, I think he's up there with the best.
Mm-hmm. And you did get to play with a Beatle.
I did.
Yeah.
George Harrison, yeah. Because
Yeah.
George was a mate of Gary's.
Okay.
And they both lived out at Henley.
Right.
Henley on Thames, outside of London. And Gary and George became very good mates.
Yeah.
George came to one of our shows one night and stood on my side of the stage for the whole gig. There was, I think it was Ian Pace and Jon Lord from Deep Purple and George Harrison all standing together on my side of the stage, only about sort of, I don't know, 3 or 4 metres away. And I thought, oh, fucking hell. Got them all standing there during the... But, you know, after a while I just forgot about them and it was and it went well. But George wrote a song for the blues album. I think it was called That Kind of Woman. And he played guitar on it, and you can really hear it's a George Harrison song.
Yeah.
And although we did our parts separately, it was nice to be on a track with a Beatle, you know, with a song that George wrote for that album.
The next guitar player I'd like to ask you about is Tony Iommi. How did your time with Tony come about?
I'd worked with a producer called Jeff Glixman with Gary Moore. And Jeff and I got on very well. He liked my playing, he liked working with me. And he was producing the Black Sabbath album, Eternal Idol. And at the time they had a bass player that they were in Montserrat in the George Martin's Air Studios in Montserrat, which isn't there anymore. It got flattened in a hurricane. But Jeff Glixman phoned me up and he said, oh, the bass player that Tony's got had to go home to take care of some personal issues or something. I can't remember what it was. He said, do you fancy doing a Black Sabbath album? I said, well, yeah, all right then. Because I had some time off. I'd been working with Gary Moore, but I had some time off. And so I think within a few days I was on a plane out to Montserrat. And I remember, obviously Tony knew how I played and how I fitted in with that sort of stuff, having heard what I'd done with Gary, and especially Ozzy, you know, because they were very familiar with the albums we'd done, The Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, and by that time Bark at the Moon and that. So he knew roughly how I played. But I remember the first day I went into the studio, and I just said to Jeff Glixman, the producer, I said, "Oh, just play me the track with just guitars and guide vocal and drums. I don't want to hear any bass because I don't want to be influenced by anything that's been put down as guides or whatever. So just play me the basic track." And I just said, well, yeah, I know what to do on this, and I did it. And then a couple of hours later, when I'd finished the track, Tony Iommi came in. And he said, well, okay, then let's hear what you've got. And Jeff Glixman played him the first track. And he said, that's great, just let him do whatever he wants, and walked out. So I thought, oh, that was good. So I had a free hand at how I wanted to, you know, play on the stuff, which was good. There was nobody sitting there saying, oh, don't do that, do this, and oh, try that, or don't do it that way, do it this way. And it was just like, okay, let him do what he wants. Yeah. And that's how I did that album, and it was...
Did you actually do any playing with Black Sabbath?
No.
Live playing?
No, they asked me to join the band at that time. Right. But I know that at the time the management was a little bit sort of shaky and things weren't getting done, and plus I was pretty happy in the Gary Moore camp. So I appreciated the offer, but I turned it down, for not because of Tony was a great guy, and the band were good lads. And
but you were committed with Gary
Moore. But I was
Moore.
sort of, I mean, I wasn't contracted to Gary Moore, and I wasn't really committed, but I was probably happier with the stability of the management and how things were being handled with Gary Moore, and I certainly wasn't unhappy in the Gary Moore band, so I continued with that rather than take a chance on something with the Sabbath thing. It was nice to be offered that, because Tony was such a great riffmeister. He sits there and riffs pour out of him, and they're good riffs too. They're not waffle or just, yeah, that'll do. He comes up with some really clever riffs.
What I notice is they're so balanced. Like, I mean, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Oh, yeah. Well, see, for the meat and potatoes of the Sabbath stuff, he was the instigator of all that,
But his solos, it makes sense. It's not just a bunch of licks.
Well, see, he's quite an intelligent, aware bloke as well. Yeah. So thought went into what he was doing.
He seems to me like obviously having two fingers damaged, he's not going to have the big technique that, say, a Steve Vai or Joe Satriani has, but nonetheless, he always sounds powerful.
Yeah,
and very muscular as a
player.
player.
You can look at things in two ways. Sometimes you could look at the thing that you got tops of two fingers cut off in a press or a guillotine or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And that's going to ruin my career. But he soldiered on. I think he cut the top off soap bottles or something, and then had things made for the top of his fingers. But it made him play in a certain way that gave him his style. So that was the silver in the cloud.
Yeah, silver line.
Yeah. So there was a positive outcome to it, that it gave him a sort of uniqueness that was really, really, I suppose, meant to happen.
Yeah. Well, we're talking about your observation.
And we auditioned Lee at Shepperton Film Studios, and as soon as he started playing, I remember.
And it was. It's considered one of the classics, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. It is, because it wasn't so mainstream, and it was a little bit more underground. But it's a very well respected album. I wish that Ray Gillen could have stayed on it, but he left the band before the album was finished. That he was the vocalist. Now, a lot of the melodies and phrasing and everything were Ray's. I wrote a lot of the lyrics for it. I helped him because he had the odd line or the title or the little bits and pieces, but I wrote a lot of the lyrics for it. But Ray had a great voice tone, and what he'd done with the vocal melodies and the phrasing suited his voice. But because he left the band, they replaced his vocals with Tony Martin. Now, Tony Martin's a great singer. He's a good singer and a nice bloke too. And he replaced everything Ray did, and he did a good job. And the album came out sounding great. But I think it would have been a little bit more original had Ray completed the album. But I suppose you asked about the highlight for me for that album. I suppose the freedom with the playing. Do what you like. You do it. You're playing it. You do what you like.
And you got the experience and chops to come up with something.
And yeah, it was really enjoyable. Yeah.
By extension,
yeah.
Having been such a big part of Ozzy's solo career, you really are a big part of Black Sabbath's story. What would you think? What are your thoughts about the early Black Sabbath stuff?
Well, I played with all Black Sabbath members, except obviously Geezer Butler, because he's a bass player. But I did some tracks on Bill Ward's album too, when he did an album called Bill Ward. Oh, no, it was called Ward 1 Along the Way. And I think that's such a good album. It's so original and unpredictable. It's great, and lots of people played on it. Jack Bruce played on it. Ozzy sang on some tracks. Zakk Wylde played on some of it. All these different people played on it, and it's a great album. And Bill Ward is such a nice bloke. I mean, to me he's always Billy Ward, because he's Billy. He's a nice bloke. But that really, I suppose, made me a complete member of the Black Sabbath family tree, having played with Billy Ward and Ozzy and Tony Iommi and all that. My first impressions, which was your question about early Black Sabbath, I remember a friend of mine, when I was first in London and I was about 21, and he said, there's this new band called Black Sabbath, and he played me a bit. And I thought it was good to hear a young band playing more heavy stuff, but instead, I mean, obviously it was a bit blues orientated and influenced, but it had that sort of hammer horror thing, that macabre essence to it, which was a little different. But I never went out and bought a Black Sabbath album, and I liked them, and they did good stuff. But I thought it was a bit too novel for me, But
I suppose that was pushed by the record label.
Of course, yeah.
And you would have done it. Ozzy Osbourne would have always had a couple of the early Black Sabbath songs in his set, wouldn't he? When you were playing.
When we first started playing with Randy and that. Yeah, we used to do a little medley at the end. We did Children of the Grave, Iron Man, and Paranoid. Because I remember one night I found a steam iron at the back in the dressing room at the back, and I thought I'll save that. And when we started doing Iron Man, Ozzy does I came out and handed him the iron. He looked at me and said, "Fucking arsehole."
Oh boy, yeah. They must have been some funny stories that, but they'll be in your book, huh?
Oh, there's lots of them. Yeah, there's some. Well, there's. I tell you, as I've been writing this book, there's sometimes I'm typing and I just burst out laughing because I think of what happened, how it happened, and to write the story, it's funny all over again, you know.
Mm.
But there, you know, there's some tragedy. There's people who die and get killed and all that. You know, people like friends like Randy and Bon Scott and people like that. But, you know, it's got a bit of everything really.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes things and so-called secrets and the funny things and the tragic things.